On the evening of September the 1st, 1939, a journalist named Mia Allen stood on a bridge over the River Thames and watched something remarkable happen. She watched the lights of London go out. Slowly, quietly, one neighborhood at a time, the great glittering city simply faded into darkness. She wrote about it afterward, still a little disbelieving. "What left us," she said, "was more than just a wartime rule," and so began one of the strangest chapters in modern human history. For nearly 6 years, millions of ordinary people gave up their nights. Cities that had been bright with gas lamps and electric lights for generations went completely dark at sunset, every single evening, because the law said they must. This series is the story of those nights. It follows the blackout from the offices where it was planned all the way into the kitchens and bedrooms and streets of the people who had to live inside it, tracing what it really felt like to spend years moving carefully through a darkness that was by turns frightening, absurd, dangerous, and sometimes in the most unexpected moments genuinely beautiful. Fact number 1. Here is something that might surprise you. Before a single enemy bomb had fallen on British soil, the blackout had already caused more civilian deaths than the enemy had. In the very first month of the war, September 1939, road deaths across Britain nearly doubled compared to the same month the year before. More than 1,000 people died on British roads in that 1 month alone. Most of them were simply pedestrians, ordinary people stepping off familiar pavements into a darkness so complete that they could no longer see the edge of the curb, the corner of the road, or the canal just a few steps to their left. A surgeon named Wilfred Trotter wrote about it in the British Medical Journal that October, and his words were quietly devastating. The German Air Force, he pointed out, had managed to kill hundreds of British civilians every single month without ever leaving the ground, without spending a single bullet, at zero cost to themselves, simply by frightening the British government into turning off all the lights. By January 1940, with the Blitz still months away, roughly 1 in every 5 people in Britain had been hurt in some way because of the blackout. The darkness, it turned out, did not need bombs to be dangerous. All on its own, in its own quiet and unglamorous way, it was already doing real harm. Fact number 2. The blackout did not happen suddenly or by accident. It had been quietly planned for years before the first night it came into force. As far back as 1937, when the threat of war with Germany was beginning to feel real, air raid precautions officers were already conducting practice exercises across the country. RAF aircraft flew over British towns at night, looking down to see just how much light was visible from above. What they found was deeply unsettling. Even cars driving on their lowest, dimmest sidelights glittered from altitude like strings of tiny beads, tracing the shape of every road and every street grid with perfect clarity. The illuminated clock faces on town halls shone like beacons, visible for miles in every direction. Even reduced street lighting created a soft orange glow that pressed upward against the clouds and gave away the shape of every city below. The conclusion was clear and uncomfortable. There could be no half measures, no exceptions for convenience, no allowance for the faint glow of a single lit window. A real blackout had to be total, or it was not a blackout at all. The regulations drawn up in response were exactly that: precise, thorough, and unsparing. Every window, every skylight, and every glass-paneled door had to be covered so completely that not one thread of light could escape into the night. The war against Germany had not yet officially begun, but the war against light was already well underway. Fact number 3. When the blackout regulations arrived, ordinary British families found themselves faced with a surprisingly difficult practical problem. How do you cover every window in your home so thoroughly that not even a hairline of light escapes? The ideal answer was heavy, dark curtains, but fabric was expensive, and within days of the announcement, the shops had sold out completely. People began improvising. Brown paper was pinned across window frames, black paint was applied directly onto glass. It worked, technically, but it also meant that during the daytime those rooms sat in a dim, almost underground gloom, cut off entirely from daylight and the outside world. The government circulated official leaflets explaining what was acceptable and what was not. Fabric shops reported selling several years' worth of dark material within the space of a few days. When London's Gaiety Theatre closed at the start of the war, its heavy brown velvet stage curtains were auctioned off at a considerable premium. Not because anyone wanted theatrical curtains, but because that weight of fabric was perfect for covering windows. There was one more complication that the official guidance did not initially mention. Blackout fabric could not be washed. Washing reduced its thickness and allowed light to seep through. So the government issued additional instructions. The curtains should be regularly vacuumed, shaken, brushed, and ironed. The ironing specifically recommended to restore their light-blocking density. Hanging and checking those curtains every morning and every evening became one of the most consistent small rituals of wartime life, repeated without fail for 5.5 years. Fact number 4. The men and women who patrolled the streets at night enforcing the blackout, the air raid precautions wardens, known simply as ARP wardens, found themselves occupying a rather awkward place in their own communities. They were ordinary volunteers, people from the same streets and the same neighborhoods as everyone else, but they had been given real legal authority. They could knock on your door. They could demand that you fix your window immediately. They could report you to the magistrate's court and have you fined. That authority did not always sit comfortably when the person wielding it was your neighbor from 2 doors down, the man you saw every week at the pub. The phrase most associated with these wardens, "put that light out," became a gentle national joke almost immediately, a shorthand for the kind of small official fussiness that the British public has always found easy to mock. The character of the ARP warden in the BBC sitcom Dad's Army, made decades after the war, preserved that ambivalence perfectly, simultaneously ridiculous and quietly heroic. But the mockery was only part of the story. These same wardens were also the first people to arrive at a bombed house. They coordinated evacuations. They guided ambulances through streets they had learnt to navigate entirely in the dark. They went out every night, in every weather, into streets that were genuinely dangerous. Many of them were killed doing it. They were irritating, essential, and very much underestimated by almost everyone around them. Fact number 5. Some of the prosecutions brought under the blackout regulations were so wildly out of proportion to what the accused had actually done that they read today more like comedy than legal history. A Naval Reserve officer was taken to court for striking a match inside a telephone box to help a woman find the dial in the dark. A man was arrested because the glow of his cigar brightened and dimmed as he smoked it, and an overly zealous police constable decided that this rhythmic pulsing might be a signal to enemy aircraft overhead. A man who struck a single match in the street to find his false teeth, which had fallen out of his pocket, was fined 10 shillings. A young mother who rushed into a room where her baby was having a fit and turned on the light before she had time to close the blackout curtain was formally prosecuted. And perhaps most bewildering of all, a man named George Lovell, who had carefully put up his blackout curtain and then stepped outside to check from the street whether any light was leaking through, a thoroughly responsible thing to do, was arrested and fined, because he was standing in the street while the faint little inspection light he was holding to check his own window was technically visible from outside. The Lord Chief Justice himself, reviewing the regulations in 1942, observed that the lighting restrictions order was so densely written, with so many articles and subparagraphs, that he found it impossible to believe it could not have been expressed in a simpler and more understandable form. Fact number 6. For large shops, factories and commercial buildings, the blackout presented problems that were considerably harder to solve than simply hanging dark curtains over a bedroom window. Department stores had been built around enormous display windows designed to catch every ray of natural light and show their goods to the best advantage. Those windows now had to be completely dark after sunset. Factories that had been deliberately designed with glass roofs, specifically so that natural daylight could flood the workshop floor and allow workers to do precise, detailed work, found it physically impossible to cover such vast areas with temporary panels. Many had no choice but to paint their glass roofs black, permanently sealing themselves off from daylight and forcing their workers to operate under artificial light around the clock. Medical officers began noticing the effects within a couple of years. They gave the resulting condition a name: blackout anemia. Factory workers who had gone months without ever seeing natural daylight were becoming persistently low in mood, fatigued, unable to concentrate, emotionally flat in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness. We would recognize it today immediately as seasonal affective disorder. At the time, it was only just beginning to be understood. Meanwhile, cinemas and restaurants faced the specific daily engineering problem of allowing customers to enter and leave without spilling any indoor light into the street. Many installed elaborate double-door systems, small enclosed lobbies between the outer and inner doors, so that one door could be opened at a time while the other remained shut, trapping the light safely inside. Fact number 7. Of all the places the blackout made difficult and stressful, railway travel at night ranked among the very worst. Station names had been removed or covered across the country, officially a security precaution to confuse any German forces who might invade, but practically very effective at confusing ordinary British passengers instead. Without station names and without platform lighting, a traveler arriving somewhere unfamiliar in the dark had almost no way of knowing where they were. Inside the carriages, the normal white light bulbs had been replaced with blue-painted ones, a dim, ghostly shade of blue that was barely bright enough to see by at all. Faces in the same compartment were impossible to make out clearly. Reading a book or a newspaper was essentially out of the question, and since the windows were covered with blackout blinds, there was no passing landscape to read either. People regularly missed their stops entirely, stepping out onto platforms they had not intended to reach, sometimes in places they had never been before. In some cases, passengers stepped out onto what they believed was a platform and found themselves standing on the tracks. The goods yards were equally chaotic. Porters loading and unloading freight at night could not read labels in the darkness, creating delays that rippled forward through the entire passenger schedule. When the war finally ended and the normal white lights returned to the carriages in 1945, travelers who had spent years under those dim blue bulbs described the change as something unexpectedly emotional. A small, quiet restoration that felt like something had genuinely been given back. Fact number 8. Unless you have stood in a blacked-out city on an overcast night, it is genuinely difficult to imagine how dark the darkness actually was. Not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom with its curtains drawn, where your eyes gradually adjust and the familiar shapes of furniture slowly become visible. This was a different kind of darkness altogether, total, external, and absolute, the darkness of somewhere underground. Harold Nicholson, stepping out of his familiar London club on the very first night of the blackout, described finding outside not the glittering city he had known all his life, but, in his own words, a pall of black velvet. One woman described her first attempt to walk through the blacked-out streets as requiring, she said, nerves as well as outstretched hands. A diarist writing in Chester in 1943, 4 full years into the blackout, described every journey across his own city, streets he had walked his whole life, as a great adventure, because most of the things he normally used to navigate by were simply gone unless he happened to be carrying a torch. He could never be certain what lay immediately ahead of him beyond about 3 feet. People began learning their neighborhoods in an entirely new way, one hand trailing along a wall, feeling for the texture of a particular fence they recognized, the slight rise of a familiar doorstep, the change in surface underfoot at a corner they knew. They were building maps from touch rather than sight, patient, slow maps of a world they had always known by looking at it, now learned over again by feeling their way through it in the dark. Fact number 9. People are remarkably inventive when they have to be, and the blacked-out streets brought out a quiet, practical creativity in the civilian population that was genuinely impressive in its variety. White paint turned out to be the single most useful material available. Local councils painted the edges of curbs white so that pedestrians could make out where the pavement ended and the road began. Car owners painted their bumpers white so that other drivers had at least a chance of seeing them coming. Traffic islands were given white stripes. Lampposts were painted with broad white bands at standing height so that people would not walk into them face first. One man in Lancashire painted his entire car white and reported, with obvious satisfaction, that other drivers seemed to give him a noticeably wider berth at night. An Essex farmer, applying exactly the same logic to a different problem, painted white stripes along the sides of his cattle to stop them being struck by vehicles on unlit country roads. Police officers directing traffic from the middle of dark intersections dipped their capes in luminous paint so that the drivers they were guiding could actually see them. Across the country, coroners at blackout-related inquests began gently advising surviving families, and through the newspapers the wider public, that carrying something white when walking at night could be the difference between being visible and being invisible. The white handkerchief, of all things, became a small wartime symbol. A simple square of ordinary fabric, folded into a breast pocket or held loosely in the hand, quietly announcing the presence of one human being to all the others feeling their way through the same dark street. Fact number 10. The darkness provided cover, and some people used that cover for purposes that caused genuine harm. Robbery and mugging increased significantly in blacked-out streets because the natural, passive deterrent of being visible to passers-by had simply been removed. Burglars who had previously been limited to the brief window of early darkness now had the entire night available to them, completely invisible in conditions the government itself had deliberately created. Looting, particularly in areas damaged by bombing, became a serious enough problem to require its own legislation. In some cases, looting during or immediately after a raid was made a capital offense. More disturbing still was the rise in violent attacks against individuals, including against women traveling alone after dark. The most notorious case was that of Gordon Cummins, a man who came to be known in the press as the Blackout Ripper. In 1942, he committed a series of murders in London, moving through the darkness of blacked-out streets where there were no witnesses and no light to betray him. He was caught, tried, and hanged, but the crimes he committed illustrated with terrible clarity just how completely the blackout had stripped away the everyday safety that visible lit streets provide. The vulnerability it created for women walking alone at night was widely understood, frequently discussed, and very poorly addressed. The same darkness that gave some people privacy and freedom gave others something far more threatening: the feeling that they could not be seen, and that nobody would see what was happening to them. Fact number 11. The blackout did something rather complicated to social life, and it did it differently depending entirely on who you were. For young people, those in their late teens and 20s, full of energy and feeling the particular urgency that wartime creates, the darkness was, in some ways, unexpectedly freeing. Couples who might have walked home together under the watchful eyes of neighbors and passers-by could now move through the streets in a privacy that peacetime had never offered. Courtships that might have taken years were compressed into weeks because the darkness removed the usual social observation, and because the war itself was always whispering its quiet reminder that time might be shorter than anyone wanted to believe. Dances still happened, people still went out, and the walk home afterward, through streets where nobody could see anyone, carried a particular kind of intimacy that the lit world could never quite replicate. But for others, women traveling alone, elderly people without a companion, anyone who had reason to feel uncertain about the strangers around them, the very same darkness was simply frightening. It offered no reassurance, no visibility, no way of reading the street ahead. Whether the blackout felt like freedom or fear depended almost entirely on who you were, who was beside you, and how safe you felt in the dark. Fact number 12. America's encounter with the blackout came later than Britain's, and it arrived for a different reason. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the immediate danger did not come from the sky, it came from beneath the sea. German submarines, U-boats, had moved into the waters along the American Atlantic and Gulf coasts, and in the early months of 1942 they were sinking Allied merchant ships at a rate that was nothing short of catastrophic. More than 100 ships were lost in the first 3 months of that year alone, and the reason, in significant part, was light. American coastal cities had refused to implement blackout measures. Their beaches and boardwalks and seafront buildings blazed with electric light every evening, and that light silhouetted the Allied merchant ships sailing past in the dark, making them effortlessly visible to German submarine commanders looking shoreward through their periscopes. The ships were lit up against the glow like shapes cut from black paper. German submariners called this period their second happy time. The ships that burned and sank off American beaches in those months were not lost because of superior enemy tactics or overwhelming German firepower. They were lost, in very substantial part, because the lights of American cities had not yet been turned off, and nobody was sitting in the dark on the shore to notice how clearly those lights were giving everything away. Fact number 13. One of the most unexpected consequences of the wartime blackout happened not in a bombed city or a darkened street, but in the clear night sky above the hills northeast of Los Angeles. There, at the Mount Wilson Observatory, an astronomer named Walter Baade was making observations that would change humanity's understanding of the entire universe. Baade was German-born, which meant that after America entered the war he was classified as an enemy alien. He was not permitted to contribute to defense research. While his colleagues worked on war projects, he was left largely alone with the observatory's powerful telescopes and the unusually dark skies that the city's wartime dim-out had created. Los Angeles had dimmed its lights, and that dimming had given Mount Wilson skies darker and clearer than the observatory had enjoyed in years. Using those skies in the autumn of 1943, Baade became the first person ever to resolve individual stars in the inner core of the Andromeda galaxy, something no previous astronomer had managed. The discovery that followed led scientists to fundamentally revise their understanding of how large and how old the universe actually is. The wartime blackout, imposed to hide cities from enemy aircraft, had entirely by accident opened a clearer window onto the cosmos than any peacetime sky had ever offered. And through that window, the known size of the universe quietly doubled. Fact number 14. Pubs had always been at the heart of British community life, and the blackout tested that position in ways that were both challenging and ultimately revealing. In the early weeks of the regulations, many publicans saw their evening trade fall noticeably. People who might ordinarily have stepped out for a drink decided that navigating the dark streets was simply more effort than it was worth, and stayed home instead. But as the months passed, something interesting happened. People found their way to their local pub anyway. They learned the route by touch and memory. They arrived in the dark, pushed through the heavy blackout curtain over the door, and found inside exactly what they had come for. Warmth, light, company, and a brief and welcome respite from the particular loneliness that the blacked-out evening could produce. For many people living alone, or in cramped households, or in the specific anxious silence of a house waiting for news from someone far away, the pub had become more necessary than it had ever been in peacetime. Getting there required a certain courage, but arriving made that courage feel worthwhile. Landlords developed careful entrance arrangements, thick curtains, carefully positioned guide lights just at the threshold, to ensure no indoor light escaped when a customer came or went. The pub in this way became a kind of warm island in the surrounding dark, maintained with genuine care, reached through genuine effort, and appreciated with a gratitude that peacetime comfort had never quite managed to produce. Fact number 15. Going to the cinema had always been one of Britain's favorite evening pleasures, and the blackout changed what that experience felt and looked like in ways that were impossible to ignore. Before the war, a cinema announced itself to the street with its lit marquee, its bright posters, its name blazing in electric light above the entrance. Under the blackout, all of that disappeared entirely. The outside of a cinema after dark looked like nothing at all, just a dark building, no different from the buildings on either side of it. Diarist Joyce Story described it as Bible black, that particular quality of total commercial darkness that made a building that had previously glittered now appear to simply not exist. Customers had to feel their way to the entrance, push through heavy blackout curtains draped across the doorway, and shuffle along narrow improvised corridors designed to trap the light inside. The paybox was so dimly lit that having exact change was more or less essential, because telling apart notes and coins in that near darkness was genuinely difficult. And yet people came. Throughout the entire war, cinema attendance remained remarkably strong. Something about the contrast, the cold, dark, uncertain street outside, And then the warm lit, story-filled screen inside made the experience feel more valuable rather than less. The effort of getting there in the dark seemed to make arriving feel like a small triumph, and the film itself felt all the more welcome for everything it had taken to reach it. Fact number 16. The Blackout created a brief and entirely unique commercial world of luminous and phosphorescent products that had never existed before and would never exist quite the same way again. Lapel badges and coat buttons were manufactured from materials that absorbed light during the day and released a soft, faint glow at night. Walking stick handles came fitted with phosphorescent grips. Small luminous discs were sold specifically to be pinned to the front of coats. Luminous armbands appeared. Luminous hatbands appeared. The BBC Home Service broadcast friendly advice, encouraging people to embrace these small glowing objects as practical protection, rather than simply accepting the dark as something to be endured helplessly. White clothing became informally popular for anyone who needed to travel after dark, and the white pocket handkerchief, previously the most unremarkable item a person could carry, suddenly acquired a quiet wartime significance as the simplest available way of making yourself visible to the people and vehicles around you in the dark. People learned to carry it folded against a dark coat where its pale square could catch whatever faint ambient light existed. Moonlight, starlight, the distant glow of a fire. Newspapers tucked under the arm served the same purpose. These small domestic solutions, a handkerchief, a folded paper, a glowing lapel pin, were the civilian equivalents of the white paint on curbs and car bumpers, improvised, practical, and quietly dignified responses to a problem nobody had asked for and everybody had to solve. Fact number 17. The blackout's effects on public health reached considerably further than the road accident statistics that most people focused on at the time. Medical officers and public health researchers watching the wartime population carefully began noticing a cluster of conditions appearing with unusual frequency among people who had been subjected to prolonged artificial light. Factory workers were the clearest cases. These were men and women working in buildings whose glass roofs had been painted black to comply with blackout regulations, sealing them away from all natural daylight from morning to evening. By 1941, medical literature was describing a recognizable syndrome in these workers: persistent low mood, reduced energy, difficulty concentrating, and a specific kind of emotional flatness that was different from simply being tired. It was given the name blackout anemia. Researchers at the time noticed a connection between this condition and the low mood some people experienced during dark winter months, but the tools to fully understand or treat that connection did not yet exist. What they could observe was plain enough. People deprived of natural light for extended periods became measurably unwell, not just sad but physiologically affected in ways that touched their productivity, their relationships, and their capacity to manage the stresses that the war was piling on top of everything else. Fact number 18. Germany's experience of the blackout was in many ways a mirror of Britain's. Though it arrived earlier and with its own particular character, Germany had actually conducted its first large-scale blackout exercise in Berlin as far back as March 1935, a full 4 years before Britain imposed its own wartime regulations. The German population had been given more time to prepare, and when the full wartime blackout came, the practical arrangements were somewhat more organized. Guide lights at street intersections were more carefully shielded. The general discipline of compliance was, by some accounts, more consistent. A report held in the British National Archives noted that the blackout in German towns was more severe than in London, with only carefully screened guide lights permitted at intersections and the surrounding darkness more thoroughly enforced. But whatever the technical differences, the human experience was broadly similar. Ordinary German civilians who had no particular enthusiasm for the war simply found themselves, every evening, retreating behind curtains and sealed doors into a domestic interior that the outside darkness had made both more necessary and more isolated. For those people, the blackout was not a patriotic act or a military contribution. It was the nightly reminder that the world outside had become something to be hidden from rather than inhabited, and that the light they had lived by all their lives was now, for reasons beyond their control, their enemy. Fact number 19. Paris under German occupation experienced a blackout that was different from Britain's in one essential way. It had not been chosen. Britain's blackout was a regulation imposed by one's own government, a collective sacrifice accepted in defense of one's own country. Paris's darkness was imposed by an occupying army, and it came packaged alongside a curfew that forbade anyone from being on the streets at all between 9 in the evening and 5 in the morning. Together, the blackout and the curfew did something to Paris that felt, to the people living through it, like a kind of death. The boulevards that had been illuminated for a century went dark. The café terraces disappeared, the theatres and their warm-lit facades vanished. The famous nocturnal energy of the city, that quality of Paris after dark that had made it feel more alive at night than most cities manage during the day, was simply extinguished all at once, replaced by streets patrolled by German soldiers and a silence that felt nothing like peace. Some cultural life continued under occupation, in a form that Parisians have been arguing about uncomfortably ever since, because attending an occupied cabaret or a supervised theatre required compromises that were hard to examine honestly afterward. But the true nighttime city of pre-war Paris, open, luminous, free, was gone, and the people who had grown up with it knew, without needing to say it aloud, that what had been broken was not merely a lighting regulation. Fact number 20. The experience of traveling by train at night under the blackout deserves its own quiet examination, because it was one of the most consistently disorienting things that ordinary civilian life required of people throughout the war. Station names had been removed or covered, ostensibly to confuse German invaders but practically confusing British passengers far more effectively. Platform lighting had been extinguished. The blue-painted bulbs inside the carriages cast barely enough light to make out the shapes of the people sitting opposite you, let alone to read, to check a timetable, or to form any sense of where you were or how close you were getting to where you needed to be. You could not look out of the window because the windows were covered. You could not read the station name because there was none. You could only listen for the sound of a voice, for the name of a place called out by a platform attendant if you were lucky, and count the stops as best you could, and hope. People missed their stations regularly. Sometimes they found themselves in entirely unfamiliar places. The train already gone, standing on a dark platform with no clear sense of what to do next. The railway staff working these conditions, porters in lightless goods yards, station attendants guiding passengers by voice alone, performed their work with a quiet, unacknowledged competence that made the whole improbable system function at all, in conditions that made functioning feel almost miraculous. Fact number 21. Children, it turns out, experienced the blackout quite differently from their parents, and for many of them the difference was surprisingly positive. For adults, the darkness was an inconvenience at best, and a genuine danger at worst, something to be managed, navigated, and endured until it finally ended. For children of a certain age, though, old enough to be curious about the world, young enough to find strangeness exciting rather than threatening, the blacked-out streets were something closer to an adventure. The familiar neighborhood, stripped of its ordinary visual identity, became genuinely mysterious. The particular sounds that darkness amplifies, footsteps echoing further than usual, voices carrying from unexpected distances, the soft rustle of something in the dark that daylight would have explained immediately, were thrilling rather than frightening, at least when you were with friends and in a spirit of exploration. Some adults noticed, with mild exasperation, that the blackout had also loosened their supervision of children considerably. The wartime preoccupation with larger fears left less attention available for monitoring where the children were after dark, and children were quick to discover and quietly enjoy this new freedom. Against all of this, of course, were the genuine dangers, the real risk of road accidents, the anxiety of being caught far from home when the air raid siren sounded. The blackout was not the same experience for every child, but for many the darkness was simply the world they had grown up in, and they had found within it, as children will, their own particular ways of making it interesting. Fact number 22. The economic life of British towns and cities was quietly reshaped by the blackout in ways that went well beyond the obvious disruption to evening trade. Shops that depended on customers browsing after work found their effective trading hours compressed into the daylight that existed before sunset, which in the depths of a British winter meant darkness arriving in the mid-afternoon, long before the working day was over. Some businesses adapted with considerable inventiveness. Fish and chip shops thrived because people wanted something hot and simple that they could collect quickly and carry home through the dark without a lengthy visit to a restaurant. Small tobacconists and newsagents managed well enough because their customers needed only seconds inside. But department stores, clothing shops, and any business that relied on customers taking their time to look and choose under good light struggled badly. Shopping itself began shifting in character. More people placed orders by telephone, arranged deliveries, or used mail-order catalogs. Habits that the blackout's restriction on evening movement accelerated significantly and that left lasting marks on retail patterns long after the lights returned. Street markets moved entirely to daylight hours. The social rhythm of shopping neighborhoods changed in ways that were not fully reversed when the war ended. The blackout had not only darkened the streets, it had quietly begun reorganizing the daily patterns of commercial life around a new and unwelcome constraint, and some of those reorganizations turned out to be surprisingly permanent. Fact number 23. The fire service faced a particular problem under the blackout that its peacetime training had not prepared it for, and that only became fully apparent when the bombing actually began. Fire engines, ambulances, and emergency vehicles were required to operate under exactly the same blackout restrictions as everyone else. Their headlights were fitted with the standard slotted metal covers that reduced the beam to a narrow, downward-directed strip, effective for a few meters at most. This meant that when fire engines were called to incidents during the Blitz, when multiple fires might be burning simultaneously across a city, when streets were damaged and familiar routes were blocked, when every second genuinely mattered, they were navigating entirely in the dark, at speeds far below anything their crews had trained to work at. Firefighters who served through the Blitz described the navigation problem as one of the things they had been least prepared for. Arriving at the general area of a reported fire was one thing. Finding the actual building, in a completely darkened street, without visual reference, was another. In those moments, the ARP wardens who had been patrolling those same streets every night for months, who knew them in the dark by touch and memory and the sound of their own footsteps, became genuinely indispensable. They ran ahead of fire engines, calling back directions, guiding crews through the darkness toward fires they could smell and sometimes hear before they could see them. Fact number 24. Night shift workers lived through the blackout in a way that combined every difficulty it created and placed them all on top of each other simultaneously. A factory worker beginning a night shift in the winter might leave home in darkness at 4 in the afternoon, travel to work through the blacked-out streets, spend 8 or 12 hours inside an artificially lit building with painted-over windows, and then travel home again in the pre-dawn dark of a February morning, never once seeing daylight, sometimes for days at a stretch. A 17-year-old Sheffield factory worker named Monica McMurray, whose diary has survived, described the combined effect of artificial light, poor ventilation, and the permanent absence of natural daylight as suffocating. That word carried more weight than it might seem. She was not just describing the air in the factory. She was describing the feeling of existing entirely inside an artificial environment with no connection to the natural rhythms of light and dark that the human body uses to locate itself in time. These workers were managing not only the physical tiredness of shift work, but the deeper, stranger fatigue of a body that had lost its bearings, that had been cut off from the morning light and the evening dark and the seasonal change that ordinarily tells us, without our having to think about it, where we are in the day and the year and the world. Fact number 25. The specific dangers faced by dock workers and harbor laborers under the blackout have largely been left out of general histories of the wartime home front, but the records of the port authorities themselves documented them with grim precision. A working harbor is an environment where the edge between solid ground and open water is the central hazard of every shift. And in the complete darkness of the blackout, that edge effectively ceased to exist as something a person could see or rely on. Workers loading and unloading ships at night moved along quaysides and gangplanks where a single misstep in the wrong direction meant falling into cold water between a moving vessel and the dock wall, a fall that was very frequently fatal. Drowning deaths among dock workers increased measurably during the blackout years, and the precautions introduced in response, white paint on quay edges, rope guides along gangways, luminous armbands for workers on waterside duties, were imperfect solutions to a danger that the darkness had made structural rather than incidental. Stevedores were encouraged to wear white gloves, following the same logic that had led farmers to paint their cattle and police officers to dip their capes in luminous paint. In a world where artificial light had been removed, the only way to be visible was to manufacture your own visibility out of whatever pale or luminous material happened to be available, one small glowing object at a time. Fact number 26. The wartime railways created a professional role that had not existed before and has not existed since: the lighting attendant on blacked-out trains. These were people employed specifically to walk the corridors of moving trains, checking that every window blind was fully drawn, that no light was escaping at the edges of compartment doors, and that passengers had not raised their blinds to peer out at the passing darkness. It was not a popular job, and it was not a popular service. Passengers who had been sitting in cramped blue-lit carriages for hours, tired and disoriented, did not welcome the interruption of someone checking their blinds. The attendants themselves worked in the dim blue half-light, managing complaints from people who had already run out of patience with the journey and found the additional intrusion more than they were willing to absorb cheerfully, and the effectiveness of the whole arrangement was genuinely limited. Passengers who waited until the attendant had passed and then quietly raised their blinds created small flashes of light at carriage windows that were visible from outside the train, particularly on curves where the train's exterior was visible from further along its own length. The lighting attendant was, in its particular bureaucratic specificity, almost a perfect emblem of the wartime approach to the blackout. A new institution, imperfectly staffed, enforcing a rule of marginal military value with a procedural thoroughness that satisfied the regulation considerably more than it satisfied the people it was meant to protect. Fact number 27. One consequence of the blackout that nobody had planned for and nobody initially expected was its effect on what people did with their evenings at home. Before the war, evenings had been mobile. You went out to the cinema, you went to the pub, you visited friends, attended evening classes, went to dances, walked to the corner shop on a whim. The blackout steadily reduced all of this, and what it left in its place was the home itself, the domestic interior, the fireplace, the wireless in the corner. The family gathered around it because going outside required effort and darkness and a certain amount of courage that not every evening's purpose justified. Home-based activities quietly flourished in this atmosphere: knitting, model making, board games, amateur music, reading, indoor photography. All of these increased significantly during the blackout years, simply because the alternative, going out, had become harder. The BBC, acutely aware that it was now the primary source of evening entertainment for a population largely confined indoors, expanded and deepened its home service programming specifically to fill those long blackout evenings. Radio personalities became genuinely intimate presences in people's lives, their voices filling rooms where the curtains were drawn and there was nowhere else to go. The wireless set in the corner went from being a useful appliance to being something closer to a companion, warm, reliable, and asking nothing of you except that you sit down, close the curtains, and listen. Fact number 28. Whether the blackout actually achieved what it was designed to achieve, preventing German bombers from finding their targets, was a question that was contested from the very beginning and has never been entirely settled. The Oxford Companion to World War II notes the argument, put forward by military historian M.R.D. Foote, that blackouts did not significantly impair navigation by bomber crews because experienced navigators were not using streetlights to find their way. They were using rivers, railway lines, and major roads, features that were visible from altitude even on moderately dark nights, reflecting whatever moonlight or starlight was available. German navigator accounts from the Blitz period confirm that the Thames, the Severn, the Mersey, and other major waterways served as clear and reliable guides regardless of whether the cities on their banks were lit or not. By 1940, the most capable German aircraft were already navigating using radio beam systems, a technology that had nothing at all to do with visible light on the ground. The Battle of the Beams, as it became known, was the electronic contest fought in parallel with the Blitz, entirely invisible to the civilian population enduring it on the ground. So the blackout's greatest practical effect may have been less about genuinely confusing enemy navigators and more about giving the civilian population the feeling that they were doing something actively useful in their own defense. A psychological contribution to morale that was real, even if the military contribution was considerably harder to measure. Fact number 29. The blackout placed particular burdens on elderly and disabled people that the official communications about the regulations largely failed to acknowledge directly. For older people with reduced vision, impaired hearing, or less confidence in their physical balance, the blacked-out street was not a manageable inconvenience. It was genuinely threatening. A coroner in Birmingham stated publicly that older people should simply abandon the habit of going out in the evenings, because the streets after dark had become too dangerous for anyone whose physical capacity was even slightly reduced. The pub visit that had structured many an older person's week was gone. The evening walk was gone. The routine social contact that had given shape and meaning to many retired lives was gone, replaced by an enforced domesticity that nobody had chosen, and that welfare organizations recognized as damaging but found difficult to address when the competing demands of wartime emergency consumed almost every available resource. The cruelty of it was quiet and specific. These were people who had spent decades in the same streets. They knew every corner, every step, every uneven paving stone by long familiarity. But familiarity counted for nothing in total darkness. The landscape they had navigated confidently every day of their adult lives had been replaced, overnight, by something their bodies could no longer safely read, and the independence that knowledge of their own neighborhood had always given them was simply taken away for the duration, without ceremony and without compensation. Fact number 30. Perhaps the most persistently remembered and most unexpectedly treasured side effect of the entire blackout was the return of the stars. Cities that had been producing enough artificial light to wash out the night sky for decades found themselves, suddenly and involuntarily, beneath a canopy of stars that many of their residents had simply never seen properly in their lifetimes. Children who had grown up in London, Birmingham, Glasgow, or Manchester and had known the night sky only as a faint orange-tinged dome scattered with the handful of brightest planets discovered, under the blackout, what a genuinely dark sky actually looks like. The Milky Way appeared, the full sweep of the galaxy, arch by arch across the darkness, visible from the middle of cities that had never before offered such a view. The BBC Home Service explicitly encouraged civilians to look upward and appreciate what the dark sky had unexpectedly given them. Broadcasting talks about the visible constellations with a warmth that invited people to find something beautiful in a situation that had been almost entirely difficult. Diarists and writers of the period returned to this experience again and again. The strange, quiet wonder of standing in a blacked-out city and seeing the universe overhead, uncomplicated by any human light. The stars above a blacked-out city were the war's most accidental gift, a reminder, available to anyone willing to stop and look up, that something vast and calm and entirely indifferent to the war continued turning quietly overhead, just as it always had. Fact number 31. Managing the blackout required an enormous amount of local, organized, community-level effort, and the network of ARP wardens that provided that effort became one of the largest volunteer mobilizations in British history. By the time the system was fully established, approximately 1.5 million people across the United Kingdom were serving as ARP wardens, an extraordinary number drawn from ordinary civilian life, and given a specific nightly responsibility for the safety of their own streets. Most wardens received only basic training, and their value lay not in technical expertise, but in something the training could not have provided: intimate local knowledge. A warden who had lived in the same few streets for years knew which house had curtains that never quite closed properly. They knew which resident was elderly and might need help getting to the shelter quickly. They knew which back alley was a shortcut to the nearest first aid post, and which had a broken paving stone that would catch you out in the dark. This hyper-local knowledge transformed the warden network from a simple enforcement mechanism into something richer and more human. A system of mutual neighborhood attention, formalizing the watchfulness that communities had always exercised informally and giving it a specific nightly purpose. The warden and the street they patrolled became, in this way, genuinely inseparable. The regulation had created the role, but it was the relationship between a person and their place that made the role actually work. Fact number 32. The practical application of the blackout extended beyond people's homes and vehicles to the entire visible fabric of the street itself, and the cumulative effect of all the white paint and white markers applied to urban surfaces gave blacked-out British streets a visual character that was quite unlike anything that had existed before or would exist again. Pillar boxes received white rings painted around their middles so that pedestrians would not walk into them. Telephone kiosks had their lower sections painted white. Sandbag barriers around important buildings had their upper edges marked in white. Tree trunks along pavements were painted with broad white bands at eye level. Under the faint available light of a clear night, starlight, moonlight, the occasional distant glow of a fire, these white markings were the only things that told you what shape the street had. The buildings behind them were black. The sky above them was black. The road surface was black. Only the painted edges glowed, tracing a minimal, ghostly outline of the city's structure against the surrounding dark. Contemporary descriptions of blacked-out British streets from this period are remarkably consistent in their impression. The same familiar city, entirely recognizable in structure and geography, and yet transformed into something that felt foreign, stripped of all color and warmth, reduced to its bare outlines by the simple removal of the light that had always given it life and character, and the comfortable feeling of somewhere known. Fact number 33. The wartime blackout and the wartime tendency toward hastened relationships were connected in ways that were widely noticed at the time, though discussed with varying degrees of directness depending on who was doing the noticing. The combination of two powerful forces, the practical privacy of completely dark streets, and the wartime emotional arithmetic that kept whispering that time might be shorter than anyone wanted to accept, created conditions in which the ordinary slow progression of courtship was frequently and significantly compressed. Marriage rates in Britain rose in the early years of the war, as couples who might have waited years for the right circumstances decided that the right circumstances were never going to arrive in quite the way they had imagined, and that waiting indefinitely was its own kind of risk. Less formally, the darkness provided space for connections and encounters that the lit, observed, socially monitored world of peacetime would have made considerably more complicated. Social historians who have studied the period note that the blackout effectively changed the terms on which public space operated, turning streets into something closer to private space in terms of the freedoms they allowed. All of this carried a specific wartime tenderness alongside its complications, because the relationships formed in compressed wartime time, in blacked-out streets, partly by letter, and always in the awareness that the person on the other side might not be there at the end of it, carried a quality of feeling that peacetime romance rarely needed and never quite replicated. Fact number 34. Farming communities experienced the blackout differently from city dwellers, and that difference is worth pausing on. Rural areas at night are already darker than cities. There are fewer buildings, fewer vehicles, fewer sources of artificial light of any kind. For country people, the adjustment required by the blackout regulations was therefore less dramatic in its immediate practical impact than the transformation experienced by someone in Birmingham or Manchester for whom street lights and lit shop windows had always been a fundamental feature of the nighttime landscape. What the blackout added to rural life was not so much deeper darkness as a specific kind of social isolation, because the activities that connected rural communities, the village pub, the Women's Institute meeting, the evening service at the parish church, the weekly journey to the nearest market town, all required travel along unlit country roads that the blackout made noticeably more hazardous. Bicycles without adequate lighting, walkers on lanes without footpaths, farm vehicles moving between fields in the dark. All of these represented real dangers that the wartime countryside managed with the same quiet improvisation it brought to every other challenge. Rural blackout injuries were less frequently documented than urban ones, partly because lower traffic volumes meant fewer collisions, and partly because the distances involved made medical response slower and records less consistent. But the people who came off bicycles on dark country lanes, or stepped into drainage ditches on unlighted tracks, experienced the blackout's physical cost as personally as any pedestrian in a city street. Fact number 35. The British have a long tradition of finding humor in things that are genuinely difficult, and the blackout gave that tradition a great deal of material to work with. Punch magazine, the principal vehicle for middle-class British satire throughout the war years, ran a sustained series of cartoons about the blackout that found steady and affectionate comedy in the physical absurdities of navigating without light. Two people walking into each other in opposite directions, each entirely invisible to the other until the moment of collision. A figure feeling along a wall in the wrong direction, hand confidently tracing a path toward a complete stranger's front door. A man stepping off a curb he had not expected to find. The genre also produced jokes about the wardens and their occasionally excessive enforcement of regulations, the prosecutions for struck matches and glowing cigars, that gave the population a way of laughing at a system they had to live under without quite challenging the need for the system itself. This humor served a specific and useful cultural purpose. It transformed the accumulated daily frustration of the blackout, the inconvenience, the occasional indignity, the bone-tiredness of navigating the same dark streets for the 500th time, into a shared comic narrative, something that could be exchanged between people with a knowing look, a wry smile, and the mutual recognition that yes, this was genuinely absurd, and the fact that they were all enduring it together was in its own way a form of company. Fact number 36. The blackout created a problem for schools and children's safety education that the pre-war road safety curriculum had simply not been designed for. Before the blackout, teaching children to be safe on roads was straightforward enough. Look both ways, use the crossing, do not run into traffic. Under the blackout, none of those precautions adequately addressed the actual conditions, because the fundamental danger was no longer carelessness. It was mutual invisibility. The child could not see the vehicle. The vehicle could not see the child. No amount of looking both ways was going to resolve a situation in which both parties existed in the same darkness, with no way of detecting each other until it was too late. Schools added blackout safety to their curricula. Children were taught to carry something white when walking at night. They were taught to stay close to building frontages rather than near the road edge, and to stand still and listen for approaching traffic rather than trying to see it. Parents who sent children to evening activities, youth clubs, choir practice, evening classes, faced a daily calculation about acceptable risk that peacetime had never required them to make. Many simply withdrew their children from evening commitments altogether for the duration, and that withdrawal left gaps in children's social and educational lives, friendships not made, skills not learned, evenings not had, that accumulated quietly across years of blackout and were only partially recovered when the lights eventually came back on. Fact number 37. The psychological experience of living inside the blackout was not uniform, and the social and financial position of the individual shaped that experience in ways that were significant and honest to name. For those with private vehicles, the blackout was an inconvenience. It slowed their journeys, reduced their confidence on the road, required them to learn routes in new ways, but it did not remove their fundamental ability to move independently and get where they needed to go. For the majority of the population who had no cars, the calculation was different. It depended entirely on the quality of local footpaths, the proximity and reliability of public transport, and the degree to which the journey ahead was familiar or unfamiliar. For people in good health, in neighborhoods they knew well, the blackout was manageable. For anyone whose physical capacity was reduced, who had recently moved and did not yet know their streets, or who had to travel regularly into unfamiliar areas of the city, it was a considerably more serious constraint. The women walking home from evening factory shifts alone, the night nurses moving between hospital buildings across unlit grounds, the the volunteers making their way to ARP posts at the start of their duty hours. All of these people navigated the wartime dark with a practical courage that the official communications about the blackout's inconveniences never quite acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required also acknowledging how unequally distributed the cost of those inconveniences really was. Fact number 38. In September 1944, the full blackout was partially relaxed and replaced with something called the dim out, a limited restoration of street lighting equivalent roughly to the level of moonlight, with the provision that full blackout could still be required immediately if an air raid alert was sounded. The response from the population was not quite what might have been expected. After 5 years of complete darkness, the return of even this minimal light was received with a quality of emotion that surprised some observers and moved others deeply. Writers and diarists who described the first evenings of the dim out reached for language that went well beyond relief. The streets felt, they wrote, like something between being gently alive again and being reminded of what had been missing so long that its absence had begun to feel permanent. Children who had grown up entirely within the blackout years and had no personal memory of streets lit by normal lamplight experienced the dim out not as a restoration but as a revelation, something genuinely new, not something returned. A Scottish schoolboy named Donald Gulliver wrote a letter to his father serving overseas that captured something of this with perfect simplicity. "The light is on at the corner," he wrote, "and I was playing under it last night and the night before." A child playing under a lit street corner, an image so entirely ordinary that peacetime parents would barely have glanced at it, had become, after 5 years of regulated darkness, something a child thought worth writing home to his father about. Fact number 39. The blackout and the fire created a paradox that the original designers of the regulations had not fully anticipated. When the Blitz began, German bombers frequently dropped incendiary bombs, small devices designed not to explode but to start fires, which then spread and created visible markers that subsequent waves of heavier bombers could follow. The problem this created for the blackout was stark and uncomfortable. A city successfully darkened against enemy aircraft became, the moment a fire started within it, more visible rather than less, because the fire burned against the total darkness of the surrounding blackout and could be seen from enormous distances and altitudes. A lit city competes with its own fires. A dark city has nothing to compete with them. Fire watchers were deployed across rooftops and in elevated positions throughout British cities, specifically to catch incendiary bombs in their very earliest stages, before the small initial glow became an uncontrollable fire that would render the entire blackout meaningless. These volunteers sat through cold, dark, quiet hours on rooftops, experiencing the blacked-out city from above, watching the invisible landscape beneath them for the first tiny points of orange light that meant something had landed and something needed to be done. Their patience and the speed with which they acted when they finally had something to act on was one of the quieter forms of wartime heroism, performed in the dark, above a city that could not see them, night after night throughout the worst of the bombing. Fact number 40. The business of obtaining proper blackout materials, good quality dark fabric, reliable blackout paint, well-fitted curtain systems, was not equally accessible to everyone, and the gap between what wealthier and poorer households could manage in terms of compliance was a genuine social equity issue throughout the blackout years. A family with money could invest in well-made, properly fitted blackout curtains that covered their windows reliably night after night for years. A family without money might be managing with brown paper and tape that deteriorated quickly, or with thin dark fabric that allowed light to seep through at the edges, or with arrangements that satisfied a cursory inspection but failed in detail. The fines issued for blackout violations represented, for a low-income household, a meaningful financial penalty, one that sometimes fell on people whose non-compliance was less about carelessness than about genuine material inability to achieve the required standard with the resources available to them. Black market suppliers who charged premium prices for blackout materials during periods of official supply shortage made the situation worse. Landlords of rented properties who passed compliance costs to tenants in legally questionable ways added further friction. The blackout was presented in public communications as a shared national sacrifice, equally distributed. The lived reality was that the sacrifice, like most sacrifices, was distributed along the same lines as most other things, falling most heavily on those already carrying the most. Fact number 41. London's taxi drivers had spent years, in some cases entire careers, building a detailed mental map of the city's streets. The knowledge, as it was formerly known, was one of the most demanding professional qualifications in the country. A comprehensive memorization of thousands of streets, landmarks and routes, tested rigorously before a license was granted. The blackout did something unexpected to all of that accumulated expertise. It did not erase it, but it partially invalidated it, because the knowledge had been built on a visually lit city, on the specific appearance of illuminated shop fronts, glowing pub signs, lit clock towers, and the particular way a familiar junction looked at night when the street lamps were working. All of those visual reference points were gone. The same streets existed, but the visual vocabulary that made them instantly recognizable had been removed, and what remained had to be relearned through different senses. Drivers began navigating by gradient, the slight rise or fall of a road that the body registers before the eye confirms it; by texture, the particular sound of wheels on a cobbled street versus a tarmacked one; by the white painted edges of curbs and pillars; by memory of distance and turning rather than sight of destination. Passengers trusted them entirely, because passengers had even less information about where they were than the driver did. A taxi journey in a blacked-out city was a small act of shared faith, and the drivers who honored it, night after night, in conditions that would have defeated a less deeply trained navigator, did so with a competence that the darkness could diminish but not extinguish. Fact number 42. When the blackout was finally and fully lifted in the spring of 1945, not all at once, but in careful stages as Allied forces advanced through Germany and the threat of air attack gradually faded, the British population's response was more emotionally complex than a simple celebration of restored light. Big Ben was illuminated on the evening of the 30th of April 1945, the day Adolf Hitler died, having been dark for 5 years and 123 days. The lighting of the clock tower was not announced as a ceremony, it was simply switched on, and yet it was seen across London and reported in the following morning's newspapers with a weight that went far beyond the logistical. Full street lighting was restored across Britain's cities on the 8th of May 1945, the night of VE Day itself. People who came out into the streets that evening to celebrate found them illuminated in a way that had not been true since the summer of 1939. What they felt standing in those lit streets was difficult to put into ordinary language. It was not simply joy, though joy was present. It was not simply relief, though relief was present too. It was also something closer to the feeling of a long-interrupted conversation being resumed. The world that they had been protecting and preserving and waiting for returned to them all at once, visible again, in a flood of restored light that nobody who experienced it ever entirely forgot, and nobody who did not experience it has ever quite been able to fully imagine. Fact number 43. The emotional cost of living inside the blackout for months and years accumulated in ways that were real and measurable, even when they were difficult to name precisely. Diaries, mass observation records, and the reports of wartime welfare organizations all document a consistent cluster of feelings that appeared in the civilian population with unusual frequency. Chief among them was something that most people described but struggled to define clearly: a background unease that was not quite fear and not quite sadness, but occupied the quiet space between them. It was not the sharp, manageable fear of a specific and present danger. It was something more diffuse and more persistent, the particular anxiety of a landscape that offered no reassurance, streets that could not be read, the perpetual awareness that whatever lay just beyond the reach of your torch beam, 2 feet of illuminated pavement and then pure dark, was simply unknown. Contemporary surveys of civilian morale found, consistently and somewhat surprisingly, that complaints about the blackout ranked higher than complaints about rationing, about bombing, or about the disruption of family life caused by military service. The darkness, more than any other single feature of wartime existence, was the thing that most people most wanted to be free of. It had not merely changed the physical character of the world outside, it had quietly and persistently lowered the emotional baseline from which people experienced everything else. And it had been doing so every evening for years. Fact number 44. Australia's encounter with the blackout came later than Britain's, and arrived with a particular urgency of its own, because the threat it was responding to was not distant but geographically close. After Japan's entry into the war in December 1941 and the rapid Japanese advance through Southeast Asia and across the Pacific, Australian cities faced the genuine and immediate prospect of air attack in a way that would have seemed almost unimaginable just months before. The brownout regulations introduced in Victoria described the situation with characteristic directness. The lights of some Australian cities, the official communication said, can be seen from as far as 50 miles away. These beacons must not guide enemy aircraft. Melbourne and Sydney implemented staged dim-out conditions that were adjusted as the perceived level of threat rose and fell. Full blackout drills were conducted periodically when intelligence suggested elevated risk. What made the Australian blackout distinctively different from the British experience was this sense of genuine proximity. Darwin was bombed in February 1942, the largest foreign attack ever carried out on Australian soil, and coastal cities that had been following the war in Europe from a comfortable distance suddenly found themselves inside it. The blackout in Australia was therefore not a precautionary borrowing of European practice, managed from a position of relative safety. It was a response to a threat that was geographically close enough to feel personal, and the population's compliance with its conditions reflected an urgency that distance had previously made it unnecessary to feel. Fact number 45. Canada's relationship with the blackout was shaped by a combination of real geographical risk on its coasts and a deeper desire, across the country's interior, to feel connected to a war that geography was otherwise keeping at a comfortable remove. On the coasts, the regulations were genuine. Halifax on the Atlantic and Vancouver on the Pacific maintained meaningful dim-out conditions based on real concerns, submarine activity in Atlantic waters and, after Pearl Harbor, anxiety about Japanese air raids on the Pacific coast. Interior cities, separated from any credible threat by hundreds or thousands of miles of land, had no equivalent military justification for blackout conditions, but they conducted blackout drills anyway, and they conducted them with a seriousness that served a purpose the geography could not provide on its own. The drill was a community event. Wardens made their rounds. Neighbors checked on neighbors. For a few scheduled hours, entire towns sat in the dark together, in conditions that bore at least a faint resemblance to what the people fighting in Europe were living with permanently. Historians who have studied these inland Canadian drills suggest that their primary value was less military than civic. They created a shared experience of wartime seriousness in communities that the actual geography of the war would otherwise never have directly touched. For one evening at a time, the distance was shortened. The war felt a little closer, and the people sitting in the dark together felt, however briefly, that they were part of the same thing. Fact number 46. Japan's civilian experience of the blackout carried a cultural weight that was particular to Japan, and that added dimensions to the experience that the European blackout had not contained. Japan's blackout regulations were introduced progressively as Allied air power over the Pacific grew through 1943 and 1944, imposed on urban populations already enduring extraordinary wartime privations, food shortages, the requisitioning of household metals, the mobilization of civilians into labor and civil defense roles that left little of daily life untouched. Japanese cities had their own distinctive nighttime culture, illuminated streets, lantern-lit market stalls, the specific warmth and color of a city that conducted much of its commercial and social life after dark, and that culture was extinguished by the blackout in a way that felt to many residents like a particular and personal loss. The government framed the darkness in the language of national survival and collective sacrifice. But for ordinary families in Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya, it was simply one more element of a daily existence that was becoming progressively diminished. When the incendiary bombing campaigns began in earnest in 1945, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo in March of that year, the blackout was revealed to have been unable to prevent the destruction it was meant to forestall. In those final terrible months, darkness and fire existed simultaneously across the same burning cities, the two most extreme conditions of light and its absence occupying the same streets at the same time, a paradox of wartime illumination that no regulation had anticipated and no darkness could have prevented. Fact number 47. The blackout left physical marks on British buildings that persisted quietly for years after the regulations ended, and in some cases have never entirely disappeared. Blackout curtains, which could not be washed and had no possible peacetime use, were discarded in their millions in 1945, contributing to the post-war salvage drives of that period. The white paint applied to curbs, lampposts, tree trunks, and building edges faded gradually across the post-war years, but remained visible in some locations well into the 1950s and beyond. Buildings that had been structurally modified for blackout compliance held on to those modifications long after they were strictly necessary. Shops that had installed double-door airlock entrance systems sometimes kept them, not because the regulations required it, but because replacing them was an expense that post-war austerity made easy to defer. Factory buildings whose glass roofs had been painted over were sometimes left dark for years, because the cost of restoring natural light to them was lower in priority than the many other demands of reconstruction. These were small things, taken individually, but collectively they constituted a kind of physical memory, the material residue of 5.5 years of regulated darkness, written into the fabric of the built environment in paint and curtain fittings and modified entrances, gradually fading as the years passed, but stubbornly present for long enough to remind anyone paying attention that the blackout had not merely been a rule that ended when it was lifted. It had been a physical transformation of the world, and physical transformations leave traces. Fact number 48. The Mass Observation Project, established in Britain in 1937 to document the everyday thoughts and experiences of ordinary people, produced an archive of blackout testimony that is unlike any other source historians have for understanding what the experience actually felt like from the inside. Mass observation diarists were not professional writers or official observers. They were factory workers and housewives and retired school teachers and shop assistants, writing about their days because they had been asked to, in their own words, at whatever length felt natural. What emerges from their blackout entries is not the composed, stoic narrative of official wartime memory, but something more honest, more varied, and more genuinely human. The same person who wrote with real frustration about the warden who knocked on their door for the 3rd time in a week also wrote, 2 pages later, about the extraordinary quality of the stars on a clear January night, and how they had stood in the garden for 10 minutes just looking up at them. The smell of the blackout curtain fabric, a specific slightly chemical smell that many diarists mentioned independently, appears in entry after entry, an involuntary shared memory that no official document had thought to record, and that no history book had thought to preserve. These details, the smell, the cold, the specific sound of a blacked-out street on a quiet evening, are the texture of the experience. They are what it actually felt like, from the inside, to live inside that particular darkness, and they exist nowhere else in the historical record except in these private, unguarded, entirely ordinary pages. Fact number 49. The blackout's effects on people with visual impairments deserve attention precisely because those effects have received almost none. For fully sighted civilians, the blackout was an unwelcome and temporary reduction of the visual environment to conditions they were unaccustomed to and badly equipped for. For people who were partially or fully blind, the situation was more complicated in ways that are worth thinking through carefully. In some respects, the conditions of the blacked-out street were not entirely foreign to people who navigated by sound and touch as a matter of daily life. But the blackout also removed the minimal ambient light that even partially sighted people rely on. The faint glow at the edge of a window, the slightly lighter quality of an open space compared to a wall, replacing it with a darkness more complete than most partially sighted people routinely experienced. Guide dogs, whose value lay in their trained awareness of obstacles and edges, found their work changed by conditions that their training had not specifically prepared them for. Line service users navigating blacked-out city centers encountered new obstacles placed as wartime precautions, sandbag barriers, redirected foot traffic, temporary structures, without the warning signage that would have made those obstacles detectable through standard tactile navigation. None of this was deliberate exclusion. The regulations had been designed for the sighted majority, and the minority for whom darkness was already a daily reality bore the additional costs of that design without complaint, without recognition, and without any particular official awareness that those costs existed. Fact number 50. The theater found itself in an interesting position under the blackout, simultaneously hindered and, in a way that nobody had planned for, quietly enriched. Getting audiences into a theater in total darkness was a genuine operational challenge. Getting them out again without spilling light into the street required careful management, and persuading people to make the effortful, dark, potentially hazardous journey to a theater in the first place required something extra, a belief that what was waiting on the other side of the blackout curtain was genuinely worth the trouble of reaching it. Many smaller venues could not manage the combination of regulatory compliance, reduced audiences, and staff pulled away by civil defense duties, and they closed. The larger, more established theaters found something different. The audiences who did make the journey arrived with a quality of attention and gratitude that peacetime theater-going had never quite produced. They had chosen to come, they had navigated the dark to get there. They had pushed through the heavy curtain at the door and found inside a lit, warm, inhabited space full of living voices and human faces, and after an evening of everything the blackout had taken away, that was precisely what they needed most. Performers who had survived their own journey through the dark to stand in front of those audiences described feeling the difference in the room. The blackout had, by making the theater harder to reach, also made it more necessary. And necessity, it turned out, was a remarkably good audience. Fact number 51. Urban Britain in 1939 contained thousands of miles of waterway infrastructure, canals, rivers, dock basins, mill ponds, that were perfectly navigable in daylight and profoundly dangerous in the dark. The white paint safety campaigns that addressed road curbs and car bumpers did not extend effectively to waterway edges, which were often in industrial areas, poorly lit even before the blackout, and frequented by workers whose routes to and from night shifts passed along them out of simple necessity. Drowning deaths among civilians navigating unlit waterfronts were recorded throughout the blackout period, and the bodies recovered from canals and dock basins on dark mornings represented a category of blackout casualty that received none of the public visibility of the road accident statistics, none of the official attention of the bombing casualty figures, and almost none of the historical attention of either. These were ordinary people doing ordinary things, walking to work, walking home, following routes they knew perfectly well in daylight, and finding in the dark an edge that their body knew existed but their eyes could not confirm in time to stop. Local canal authorities introduced rope guides and painted markers where they could. Some workers took to feeling their way along familiar towpath walls with an outstretched hand. Others simply accepted the risk as one more element of a daily life that had accumulated more risks than any peacetime existence was supposed to contain, and walked carefully in the dark, hoping that tonight, like last night, the edge would not surprise them. Fact number 52. Hospitals faced a specific and particularly demanding set of blackout challenges, because the things that hospitals most needed, light for clinical work, light for safe patient movement, light for emergency procedures, were precisely what the blackout regulations required to be suppressed or strictly managed. Nursing staff working overnight wards needed enough ambient light to observe patients without waking those who were sleeping, a requirement that was fundamentally in tension with the demand for complete light suppression. Managing blackout compliance across a large hospital building, dozens of wards, multiple floors, the constant movement of staff and patients at all hours, required sustained effort that diverted energy from the primary work of care. Surgical theaters had to be converted into sealed light traps, their windows modified, and their ventilation systems adjusted to allow strong operating lights to function without any illumination escaping outward. Some hospitals reported using more staff resources on blackout management during the Blitz period than on any single clinical function other than direct patient care. Emergency procedures during air raids added the specific challenge of moving patients to shelter areas in near total darkness, an operation that required improvised solutions that medical training had not provided, and that the nurses and orderlies who performed it developed on the spot, out of necessity, in the middle of the night, while the bombing was happening outside. They always managed. But the cost of managing in those conditions was considerable, and it was paid every single night. Fact number 53. The dramatic rise in road accident rates that followed the blackout's imposition affected the insurance industry in ways that its actuarial models had not anticipated and could not easily absorb. Motor insurers faced a surge in claims corresponding directly to blackout conditions, with accident rates peaking on the darkest winter nights and declining measurably during periods of better moonlight or when weather kept vehicles off the roads entirely. The government's attempt to manage road risk, a mandatory 20 miles per hour nighttime speed limit, and the requirement for headlamps fitted with slotted metal covers, reduced the severity of some accidents without eliminating them, because the combination of reduced speed and dramatically reduced visibility still left a fundamental gap between what drivers could see and what was actually ahead of them. Pedestrian deaths accounted for the majority of blackout road fatalities throughout the war, and the pattern of those deaths told a consistent story. They were not in most cases the result of recklessness or inattention. They were the result of two parties, a driver who could see almost nothing, and a pedestrian who could see almost nothing, occupying the same dark space at the same moment without either having sufficient warning of the other's presence to do anything about it. The people most frequently killed were those with no vehicle at all, the ones walking through the dark because they had no other way of getting where they needed to go, and whose only protection against the traffic they could not see was the white handkerchief folded hopefully into a coat pocket. Fact number 54. Bus drivers and conductors working under the blackout operated in conditions of sustained difficulty that rarely attracted the public recognition that other wartime service roles received, but which were genuinely demanding in ways that anyone who experienced them understood immediately. The bus itself moved through streets where the driver's effective visibility was reduced to a few meters, navigating routes they knew by memory rather than sight, stopping at points marked by nothing more than a white-painted curb edge and their own accumulated knowledge of where the stop had always been. Conductors whose job included managing passengers boarding and alighting at stops could not read the destination board on the approaching bus because the destination board was unlit. They could only wait in the dark and listen for the conductor's call, hoping it was the right number. Passengers inside the bus could not read street names to track their progress, because street names had been removed or were simply invisible in the dark. They counted stops and trusted the conductor's announcements and hoped they would recognize the moment when they needed to get off. When they did not, when they found themselves in the dark at the wrong stop, the bus already moving away. The process of reorienting and finding their way to wherever they actually needed to be was a small adventure that nobody had asked for, and that the official communications about blackout travel had not adequately prepared them for. The bus conductors who managed all of this, night after night, with patience and good humor and a steady voice calling into the dark, deserve considerably more historical acknowledgement than they have received. Fact number 55. The blackout put a specific kind of pressure on the social bonds of neighborhoods, and the way those bonds responded to that pressure revealed a great deal about the communities they held together. The darkness made it harder for older or vulnerable neighbors to manage their own compliance. Heavy curtains needed hanging, back windows needed checking, shelter access needed maintaining, and this created a quiet demand for practical assistance that fell, in practice, on whoever was available and willing on any given evening. In some streets, this demand was met with the kind of uncomplicated neighborly generosity that the war is remembered for. People checking in on elderly neighbors as a matter of course, sharing torch batteries, coordinating shelter arrangements without being asked. These were genuine acts of community, spontaneous and consistent, and they built relationships between neighbors that peacetime proximity had not necessarily created. In other streets, the same pressures produced different results. The household whose curtains were chronically inadequate and who generated regular warden visits became a source of communal exasperation. The family whose shelter was shared but whose contribution to its maintenance was minimal created a quiet resentment that the shared danger of the situation did not entirely dissolve. The blackout, in this sense, was a prolonged and somewhat unforgiving test of what each neighborhood actually was, of whether the proximity of houses translated into the proximity of people, applied without mercy every evening for 5.5 years, in conditions that made it impossible for anyone to pretend the test was not happening. Fact number 56. The countryside experienced the blackout differently from the cities, and that difference is easy to overlook in histories that focus naturally on the urban experience where most of the population lived and most of the records were kept. Rural villages at night are already darker than cities. Fewer buildings, fewer vehicles, no background glow from distant commercial districts. And for country people, the adjustment required by the regulations was therefore less dramatic than the shock experienced by someone in a major city whose entire familiar nighttime landscape had been suddenly extinguished. What the blackout added to rural life was not so much deeper darkness as a specific intensification of isolation, because the activities that connected village communities to each other and to the wider world, the pub, the church meeting, the market town cinema, required journeys along unlit country lanes that the blackout made noticeably more hazardous for cyclists and pedestrians. The lanes that had always been walked and cycled in the evenings without much thought were now genuinely difficult in the dark, their edges invisible, their surfaces unreliable underfoot, and their familiar distances somehow harder to judge when there was nothing to see along the way. Country people had always known darkness better than city people, and they managed. But managing still had a cost, still meant arriving home later than expected, still meant the occasional fall, still meant the particular weariness of a journey through the dark that had taken twice as long as it should have, on legs that were already tired from everything else the day had asked of them. Fact number 57. Domestic animals contributed their own small and largely unexamined strand to the blackout's social history, and the challenges they created for their owners were surprisingly consistent across the country. Dogs that needed to be walked in the evening, which for working households was the primary time available, had to be exercised in conditions that changed their behavior in ways their owners found difficult to predict. A dog moving through a dark street was more alert, more reactive to sounds, more likely to pull unexpectedly towards something invisible to the person holding the lead. Retrieving a dog that had slipped its lead in a blacked-out street was an exercise in patience and mild panic that many owners experienced at least once. Cats, whose preference for nocturnal independence had always been a mild domestic inconvenience, became a source of genuine nightly worry under the blackout, because a cat that had gone out in the evening into blacked-out streets could not be called back reliably and could not be seen. Many owners simply kept their cats indoors after dark for the duration, a compromise that the cats accepted with varying degrees of grace. There was also the question of pets and shelters, the practical challenge of gathering animals quickly during an air raid alert, when the priority was moving a household to safety but the animals were somewhere in the dark and had no understanding of what the siren meant. These were small difficulties in the context of the war, but they were real and daily, and they occupied a small, persistent corner of millions of people's wartime thoughts. Fact number 74. The wartime blackout gave the British public an unexpected and almost entirely unintended gift, a renewed relationship with the night sky. Cities that had been washing out the stars with artificial light for decades found themselves, suddenly and involuntarily, beneath a sky that had not been properly visible from their streets in living memory. The response was genuine and widespread. Books about the night sky, practical guides to constellation identification, introductions to the movements of the visible planets, seasonal guides to what was worth looking for and when, sold in numbers that their publishers had not anticipated, suggesting an appetite for the subject that the wartime darkness had opened up in people who had never previously thought of themselves as particularly interested in astronomy. Astronomy clubs and informal observing groups formed in neighborhoods where the shared experience of the blackout sky had created a shared curiosity about what was visible within it. The BBC broadcast talks about the stars with a warmth that invited people to find something genuinely worthwhile in the enforced darkness, to stand in the back garden or on the doorstep for 10 minutes before going inside, and look up and notice. People who did this, many for the first time in their adult lives, described the experience with a consistency that suggests it was more than just a pleasant distraction. It was a reconnection with something enormous and ancient and entirely indifferent to the war, a sky that had been turning quietly overhead throughout all of human history, and that the blackout had finally, accidentally made visible again. Fact number 75. When the full blackout was gradually relaxed through the autumn of 1944, something interesting happened that the government had not entirely anticipated. People did not simply switch the lights back on and resume where they had left off. The habits of 5 years of darkness had gone deeper than any regulation, and they did not dissolve the moment the regulation changed. Civilians who had spent half a decade policing their own compliance with extraordinary care, checking every window before leaving the house, maintaining blackout curtains with the specific domestic rituals the government had recommended, managing every source of interior light with a precision that had become entirely automatic, found that the relaxation of those requirements did not immediately free them from the reflexes those requirements had built. Wardens reported that residents continued seeking advice about what was now permitted long after the official communications had made the answer quite clear. Some households maintained their blackout curtains well into the dim-out period, partly from sheer habit and partly from a quiet, unspoken anxiety that the relaxation might be premature, that something was not yet quite over, and that the confidence of leaving a light on might still, somehow, carry a risk that caution was not yet ready to dismiss. The emotional complexity of this response, the difficulty of unlearning 5 years of deeply conditioned darkness, was something the government's communications had not anticipated. The blackout had been easier to impose than anyone expected. It turned out to be considerably harder to lift. Fact number 76. The wartime blackout left physical traces in British buildings that persisted quietly for years after the regulations ended, visible to anyone paying attention but rarely remarked upon. Blackout curtains, which could not be washed and had no possible peacetime use, were discarded in large quantities in 1945, their specific utility rendered obsolete overnight. The white paint applied to curbs and lamp posts and tree trunks faded gradually across the post-war years, still clearly visible in some locations well into the 1950s. Buildings modified for blackout compliance held their modifications longer than strictly necessary. The double-door airlock systems in cinema and restaurant entrances, the modified emergency lighting in hospitals, the painted-over glass roofs of factories that had been designed to work by natural light. Restoring those buildings to their pre-war condition required money and effort that post-war austerity made easy to defer, and so the modifications remained, silent evidence of the conditions that had required them. In this way, the blackout persisted in the physical world long after the human beings who had lived inside it had moved on to other things. Not dramatically, not visibly unless you knew what you were looking at, but stubbornly, in the faded white band around a lamppost that nobody had repainted, in the slightly heavier than necessary curtain fittings that remained above a shop door long after the curtain itself was gone. Small material memories of 5.5 years of regulated darkness, fading slowly into the ordinary fabric of a world that was trying, with varying success, to leave them behind. Fact number 77. Small market towns, the particular England of high streets and weekly markets, communities large enough to have a real evening social life but small enough for everyone to know everyone else, experienced the blackout with a social intimacy that the anonymity of cities did not produce. In a large city, the warden who knocked on your door was a stranger. The fine you received was processed by a court with dozens of other cases, and the social exposure of a blackout violation was limited and quickly forgotten. In a small town, the warden was the grocer. The constable was the son of the woman who lived 2 streets over. The fine was reported, as all local court proceedings were, in the newspaper that everybody read, and the neighbor whose curtains never quite closed properly was a topic of gentle communal discussion that persisted long after the specific incident had been resolved. The woman fined for a light left on while she was at work carried the knowledge of that fine into every subsequent social encounter in a community where social encounters were impossible to avoid. This was not cruelty, it was simply the inevitable texture of small-town life applied to a wartime regulation, but it added a layer of social pressure to blackout compliance in these communities that was entirely absent from the metropolitan experience, and that made the management of the regulations something that could not be separated from the management of one's standing in a place where standing mattered and was for most people the result of a lifetime's careful cultivation. Fact number 78. Rationing and the blackout operated simultaneously throughout most of the war years, and the combination of the two created a compound form of domestic restriction that was harder to bear than either would have been alone. Rationing constrained what could be eaten, purchased, and used. The blackout constrained when and how freely people could move outside the home. Together they created a daily life in which the domestic interior was simultaneously more central, because going out was difficult and often unrewarding, and more depleted of the pleasures that home normally provided. A meal prepared from rationed ingredients, eaten in the inadequate light of a blacked-out room, by a household that could not go out afterward and had nowhere in particular to go even if it could. This was the texture of many wartime evenings, repeated across years. The sensory richness of a well-lit kitchen, the visual pleasure of a properly presented meal, the simple pleasure of an evening that moved freely between indoors and outdoors as mood and inclination suggested, all of these were reduced or removed by the combination of the two systems operating together. People adapted, as they adapted to everything. But the cumulative effect of all the small reductions happening simultaneously, across every dimension of ordinary daily life, produced a grey texture to wartime existence that was harder to articulate and harder to remember precisely than any specific individual hardship. It was the compound quality of the whole, the steady diminishment of ordinary pleasure in every direction at once, and the blackout, more than almost anything else, was responsible for giving that compound its particular flavor. Fact number 79. The world of professional nighttime entertainment, the dancers, comedians, musicians and variety performers who had built their careers around the economy of evening public performance, was tested by the blackout in ways that required genuine resilience and produced genuine creativity. Many smaller venues closed in the early weeks of the regulations, unable to manage the combination of compliance requirements, reduced audiences and the competing demands of civil defense on their staffing. Performers who had worked those venues found themselves adapting out of necessity, shifting to afternoon performances, taking their acts to factory canteens and works clubs that served daytime shift populations, performing for hospital patients and convalescent troops in conditions that ranged from purpose-built indoor stages to improvised corners of hospital wards. ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association, known affectionately and somewhat ironically among performers as Every Night Something Awful, organized entertainment for military personnel both in Britain and overseas, creating a wartime performance economy that partially substituted for the disrupted civilian one. Performers who navigated all of this, adapting their material, traveling in blackout conditions to venues that might be unavailable or damaged on arrival, performing sometimes in genuine physical danger, carried away from those years a professional education in flexibility and improvisation that no peacetime career could have provided. The ability to perform anywhere, for anyone, under any conditions, and to find within whatever constraints the situation imposed a way of doing what you came to do. This was the blackout's specific gift to the entertainers who survived it. Fact number 80. The way the blackout has been remembered in the decades since the war ended tells us something interesting about how collective experience is processed and passed on. The danger, the road deaths, the canal drownings, the crime, the violence, has tended to recede in favor of the warmth and the community, the shared jokes about wardens, the unexpected beauty of the stars, the particular coziness of an evening gathered around the wireless with nowhere else to go. This selective memory is not dishonest. All of those things were real, but it represents the natural tendency of retrospective memory to organize experience into a shape that emphasizes what was survived rather than what was endured. Veterans of the blackout years, interviewed in the 1970s and 1980s, consistently described the period with a nostalgic warmth that surprised their interviewers, given the objective conditions under which those years had been lived. What had felt, from the inside and in the moment, like an imposition of considerable cost had become, in retrospect, part of the texture of a period that those who had lived through it recognized as significant, a time that had tested them and found them sufficient to the test. A time that had taken things away, and in the taking had given other things back that they had not expected and could not have predicted. The stars, the community, the quiet pride of having managed. These were not compensations they had chosen. They were what the darkness had left when it finally lifted, and they turned out, in the end, to be worth keeping. Fact number 81. The blackout's effect on domestic safety inside the home, as opposed to the more widely discussed dangers of the street, was documented with quiet consistency in insurance records and hospital admissions throughout the war years. Falls on staircases navigated in inadequate light increased significantly as household members moved through their own homes in the dimness that blackout-compliant interior lighting produced. Burns from candles and oil lamps used as supplementary lighting in households where the electricity bill had become difficult to manage were another documented category of blackout-related injury that occurred entirely within the domestic interior. The government's insistence on total blackout compliance had created conditions in which the safe management of interior light was a daily challenge rather than a passive certainty, and the people who found that challenge most difficult were typically the people least equipped to manage it: the elderly, those with visual impairments, those whose financial circumstances limited their ability to maintain adequate interior lighting within the regulatory constraints. Elderly people who rose in the night in their own familiar homes encountered a darkness that was qualitatively different from the darkness of a pre-war bedroom. It was a regulated darkness, a darkness that had been deliberately deepened by the removal of every ambient source of light that might otherwise have provided minimal orientation. The home had always been the place of safety. Under the blackout, the home was still safer than the street. But it was no longer entirely safe, and the statistics of wartime domestic injury reflected that uncomfortable truth, quietly and consistently across every year of the regulations. Fact number 82. The art produced during and immediately after the blackout years constitutes a visual record of an aesthetic that was entirely specific to its historical moment and that no later reconstruction could replicate. Henry Moore's shelter drawings, made in underground stations where Londoners slept during the Blitz, capture the specific quality of human figures illuminated by minimal artificial light against deep surrounding shadow. Paul Nash's night landscapes hold the peculiar quality of a countryside stripped of artificial illumination and returned to something older, something that existed before electricity and that the blackout had involuntarily restored. The photography made under blackout conditions was technically demanding and produced images with a distinctive character: the white painted edges of things glowing against absolute darkness, the occasional narrow cone of torchlight illuminating a small circle of pavement, the blue-lit interior of a railway carriage glimpsed through a gap in a blind. These images have an aesthetic quality that is entirely the product of their conditions, not arranged to look like darkness but actually made inside it, by photographers managing their craft under the same restrictions as everyone else who had to function in that world. They constitute a visual archive of a specific historical reality that cannot be reconstructed, and that the passing of the generation who lived it is making increasingly impossible to fully understand from the inside. What remains in those images is the light that was left, the small, carefully managed remnants of illumination in a world that had done its best to extinguish it entirely. Fact number 83. The lifting of the blackout in the spring of 1945 produced emotional responses that took some observers by surprise, because they were quieter, more tentative, and more inward than the straightforward celebration that the end of darkness might have been expected to generate. When Big Ben was illuminated on the 30th of April 1945, and full street lighting was restored across Britain's cities on VE Day, the people who came out into the lit streets did not uniformly experience uncomplicated joy. Many diarists recorded something closer to disorientation. The light felt strange after years of carefully managed dimness, too bright, almost aggressive, more demanding of the eyes than they had been asked to manage for a very long time. Streets that were familiar by day looked quite different when seen fully illuminated at night for the first time, more detailed, more complex, somehow both smaller and more themselves than the mental images that years of knowing them only in darkness had produced. Children who had grown up entirely within the blackout years and who had no memory of lit streets experienced the change not as a restoration but as a revelation, something entirely new. Their parents, who did remember the lit streets of before, experienced the change as a reunion, the recovery of a relationship with their city that the blackout had put in suspension for so long that its return carried the particular tenderness of something recovered rather than simply continued. The lights came on, the world looked different, and for a moment before the ordinary resumed its governance it was simply extraordinary. Fact number 84. Neutral countries, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, each navigated the blackout from a position of political and ethical complexity that the belligerent nations did not share. Ireland, which maintained a neutrality it described as the emergency, found itself in a particular awkwardness. A fully darkened Ireland could be mistakenly targeted by Allied aircraft navigating by the absence of light. A fully lit Ireland would serve as a navigational beacon to German bombers targeting Britain. The compromise that resulted was a partial, inconsistently enforced set of lighting restrictions that satisfied neither argument and attracted criticism from both sides. Switzerland, surrounded entirely by countries at war and genuinely at risk of being bombed by either side through navigational error, introduced blackout measures in November 1940 and maintained them with a thoroughness that reflected the seriousness of its situation. Sweden's neutrality also produced blackout conditions, partly protective and partly expressive of a society acutely aware of its position on the edge of a continent that had gone dark around it. In these neutral countries, the blackout was not a collective wartime sacrifice undertaken in service of a cause. It was a precautionary adaptation, a recognition that the darkness of war did not respect political positions, and that even those who had chosen not to fight still had to manage the consequences of being alive in a world that on all sides and in all directions had decided to turn the lights off and prepare for the worst. Fact number 85. The wartime generation's experience of what cities look like without artificial illumination contributed, decades later, to a growing conversation about light pollution that the people who joined that conversation could not have had without having once stood in the dark and looked up. When environmentalists and astronomers began arguing seriously in the 1970s and 1980s that the artificial light flooding the night sky was having measurable negative effects on both human experience and the natural world, they were making an argument that anyone who had lived through the blackout years could understand from direct personal experience rather than simply from data. The wartime generation remembered the stars above blacked-out London. They had stood beneath them. They had found them beautiful and unexpected and consoling in ways they had not anticipated. When the scientists described what was being lost to light pollution, these people did not need to be persuaded that the loss was real. They had already seen it restored once, involuntarily, and they remembered what it looked like. They brought to the conversation about light pollution a kind of testimonial authority that no amount of astronomical data could have provided, the lived knowledge that what was being argued about had once existed within living memory, above the rooftops of the most densely populated cities in the country, and that its absence from the modern sky was not a theoretical deprivation but a specific and documentable loss of something that had been there, and had been beautiful, and had been taken away so gradually that most people had forgotten it was ever there to begin with. Fact number 86. The blackout left a permanent mark on the English language itself, and that mark is worth noting precisely because it is so thoroughly invisible. Before 1939, the word blackout referred primarily to a temporary loss of consciousness, or to the theatre practice of extinguishing all stage lights simultaneously. The wartime regulations gave the word an entirely new and enormously powerful set of associations of deliberateness, of institutional authority, of the suppression of something that would otherwise be visible, that have never left it. In post-war usage, to black something out is to hide it, to prevent it from being seen or known, to exercise a kind of official control over information or illumination that the word carries regardless of context. Broadcasting blackouts, media blackouts, the blackout of information, all of these usages carry the residue of the wartime experience in their connotations whether or not the people using them are aware of it. The word had been changed by 5 years of lived reality, and it carried that change forward into a language that would use it in new contexts without always knowing where those connotations had come from. Language is one of the places where history persists longest, because it persists there invisibly, in the weight of words that were shaped by experiences now largely forgotten, still carrying the pressure of those experiences in every sentence that uses them long after the people who gave them that pressure have gone. Fact number 87. The communities of people who carry living memories of the blackout are now very small, very elderly, and diminishing with every passing year. The oral historians and local archive projects that have been working to collect their testimony understand this urgency intimately, that what is being gathered in these interviews and these recorded conversations is not merely interesting social history, but the last available access to a form of knowledge that exists nowhere except in the bodies and memories of people who actually lived inside that particular darkness. What these testimonies preserve that no document can is the sensory specificity of the experience. The particular smell of blackout curtain fabric, described independently by diarist after diarist in the same terms, a slightly chemical, slightly dusty smell that was entirely its own. The exact quality of an overcast night in a blacked-out city when there was no moon and the darkness was total and the only way to move was very slowly and very carefully, one hand trailing along whatever wall was available. The specific social texture of a street full of people who could not see each other but could hear each other and had developed, over years of practice, a shared etiquette for existing together in conditions of mutual invisibility. These are the things that the archive loses when its last living witnesses are gone. They cannot be reconstructed. They can only be preserved, while there is still time to preserve them, by asking the people who carry them to speak before the darkness that is always coming for memory, as for everything else, arrives and takes them with it. Fact number 88. The people of France, the Netherlands, Belgium and the other liberated countries of Western Europe experienced the end of the blackout in a way that was qualitatively different from the British experience, because for them the darkness had not been their own government's protective measure. It had been the occupying power's imposition, and it had been experienced as part of the apparatus of subjugation rather than as a shared national sacrifice. When Allied forces liberated these cities and the blackout ended, the return of light was inseparable from the return of sovereignty. The lit street was not merely a safer or more convenient street, it was a free street, a street that belonged again to the people who lived on it, that could be walked in the evening without fear of German patrols, that could be illuminated without asking anyone's permission. The photographs of liberated Paris, of Amsterdam in May 1945, of Brussels in the days after liberation, show streets not yet fully restored to their pre-war brightness. There were still shortages, still practical constraints, but from which the specific, controlled quality of occupation darkness had been removed. The faces in those photographs carry an expression that is distinct from simple relief. It is the expression of people who have been given something back that they had not merely missed, as the British missed their streetlights, but had mourned the loss of sovereignty over their own nights and their own illuminated streets, restored to them at last after years of living in someone else's deliberately imposed dark. Fact number 89. The wartime blackout left a legacy in fire safety and emergency lighting standards that is still visible in the built environment today, though almost nobody connects it to its origins. The experience of navigating large buildings in near-total darkness during the war revealed with uncomfortable clarity how inadequate the pre-war provision of emergency lighting had been, and drove the development of the standardized, self-powered emergency exit systems that became a fixture of post-war building regulations across every country that had experienced the blackout. The specific requirements that emerged: emergency lighting must function independently of the main power supply. Exit routes must be continuously illuminated at a level sufficient for safe evacuation. Emergency signs must be visible from minimum specified distances, were all shaped by the direct wartime experience of what happened when those provisions were absent. The green exit signs that are now a universal and entirely unremarkable feature of every public building in the developed world represent, in a very real sense, the institutional memory of a generation that learned through years of mandated darkness exactly what a human being needs to be able to see in order to find their way to safety. The blackout's lesson was written into building codes and fire safety regulations that have saved thousands of lives in the decades since the war ended. It is a legacy that is invisible precisely because it works, and that almost nobody standing beneath one of those green signs in a hotel corridor or a cinema foyer would ever think to trace back to the darkness that made it necessary. Fact number 90. The last winter of the war in Europe, 1944 into 1945, was experienced by civilian populations across the continent in conditions of extreme cold and fuel scarcity that added one more layer of difficulty to lives already carrying more than enough. In the Netherlands, the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 brought fuel conditions so desperate that families began systematically dismantling wooden furniture to burn for warmth, starting with the least necessary items and working inward week by week until only the essential remained. In Germany, urban households burned whatever combustible material the rubble provided. In Britain, coal rationing had reduced the average household's weekly allocation to levels that could heat one room adequately or several rooms inadequately, and the morning decision of which room to heat and which members of the household would spend the day in it was made by women managing households in which the margin between bearable and unbearable was narrow enough to feel physically. The bodily experience of sustained cold, the way it changes every domestic activity, slows every movement, concentrates every thought on the simple need to maintain body temperature, is a sensory reality of that final wartime winter that no document adequately captures. The people who lived through it remember it in their bodies, the cold and the dark and the waiting for both to end, and the particular quality of the spring that finally came, the warmth of it, the light of it, the feeling of something enormous and long withheld being gently and completely given back. Fact number 91. The children born in the early years of the war, those born in 1939, 1940, and 1941, grew up inside the blackout as their only known version of the world. For these children, the gas mask hanging by the door was simply the thing that hung by the door, as unremarkable as a coat hook. The Anderson shelter at the bottom of the garden was a place to play on dry afternoons and to sleep on certain nights. The ration book was how food had always worked, because it had never worked differently for them. The blue-lit railway carriage was simply what railway carriages were. These children did not experience wartime as an interruption of normality, because wartime was their normality, and they had no other version of the world to compare it against. Child development researchers studying the post-war generation in the late 1940s noticed something interesting. The children with no pre-war memory adjusted to peace with an ease that surprised the adults around them. Researchers initially attributed this to resilience. They later recognized it as something simpler. These children had not lost anything they knew they had. The war was not a disruption of their world. It was the beginning of it. The blackout, the rationing, the shelters, the news at 6. These were the first furniture of their minds, the original conditions of existence. And when those conditions changed, they simply absorbed the change and continued. With the uncomplicated adaptability of people for whom the world has always been in the process of becoming something slightly different from what it was yesterday. Fact number 92. The wartime relationship between people and their gardens, the transformation of ornamental flower beds into productive vegetable plots, and the daily labor that transformation required, has been extensively documented at the level of government policy but almost never examined as a personal daily experience. The Dig for Victory campaign records show the scale of what happened. The daily 20 minutes in the vegetable plot, performed early in the morning before work or in the fading evening light before the blackout required everyone indoors, show what it actually felt like. The garden operated on a temporality entirely independent of the war. Seeds germinated on their own schedule. Beans did not wait for the news. The daily work of tending something growing, watering, weeding, tying up, watching for signs of pest damage, was a daily encounter with a form of life that was proceeding normally, quietly, without any reference to the conflict around it. And that quality of normality was, for many people who wrote about it, a source of genuine daily consolation. Several mass observation diarists described the garden as the one place where the war did not feel present, not because it was possible to forget the war there, but because the garden's own quiet requirements demanded a quality of close, patient attention that left no room for the particular textures of wartime anxiety. To be fully present with a row of carrots was, for the duration of that presence, to be somewhere the war could not reach, and that small daily somewhere mattered more than it might sound. Fact number 93. One of the most completely erased daily habits of wartime civilian life was the practice of what might be called informal news exchange. The daily circulation of local information between neighbors, shopkeepers, and community members that supplemented and sometimes corrected the official broadcasts. This was not rumor in the pejorative sense that government information officers used when they warned against it. It was something more specific and more valuable, a daily aggregation of genuinely local intelligence that no official channel could have provided, and that communities depended on in ways they were not always aware of. Who had received a telegram that morning? Which factory had been damaged in the previous night's raid? Whether the delivery had arrived at the grocer's? What the warden had said at the corner? What the doctor had told the family at number 14? This information moved through communities along the routes that daily life provided: the queue at the butcher's, the school gate, the exchange of a few words at the garden fence, and it built, day by day, a picture of local reality that was more granular and more immediate than anything the BBC broadcast. The people who served as the nodes of these informal networks, the postmistress, the corner shop owner, the district nurse, the school secretary, performed a daily information function of genuine social value, entirely without official recognition, without formal record, and without any acknowledgement that what they were doing was, in its own quiet way, as important to the functioning of their community as anything the official civil defense structure provided. Fact number 94. Making a bed in wartime conditions was, for a surprising number of people, a daily negotiation between the institutional demands of military or civil defense routine and the simple material reality of not quite having enough to work with. For soldiers in field conditions, the military requirement for a properly made bed, tight corners, smooth surface, everything exactly so, was maintained even when the mattress was a ground sheet and the pillow was a pack and the available bedding was whatever the quartermaster had most recently provided. For civilians whose Anderson shelters had become de facto bedrooms during the Blitz, the daily making of that underground bed involved the specific challenges of damp, cold, and whatever combination of coats and blankets and newspaper insulation had been assembled to make the shelter habitable. Old coats laid over sleeping children, newspaper packed against the corrugated steel walls to reduce the cold that came through them, bodies arranged by size and warmth requirement. And then, in the morning, the folding and tidying of all of this, the daily restoration of order to a space that the night's conditions had been doing their best to disorder. The made bed, neat and functional, was in both the military and the civilian context an assertion of the same basic thing, that order was worth maintaining, that the effort of imposing it on difficult conditions was not wasted, and that the day should begin with something that looked, at least, as though it had been prepared for deliberately and faced with composure. Fact number 95. The wartime teenager, those aged 14 to 17 throughout the war years, too young to serve, old enough to understand, occupying a peculiar in-between position in every social structure the war created, has been examined largely through the lens of their eventual contributions as young adult soldiers or workers, and almost never in terms of what their daily civilian life as adolescents actually required of them. In many households, the absence of fathers and the full employment of mothers had left teenagers functioning as the primary supporting adult, managing younger siblings, performing domestic tasks that would otherwise have fallen to a parent, making decisions that peacetime would not have placed in their hands for years. Alongside these adult responsibilities, they retained the completely legitimate needs of adolescence, the desire for peer company, for amusement, for the testing of identity against the world. Needs that the war complicated without abolishing and that the adults around them were often too exhausted to help them meet. The daily negotiation of these competing demands was performed by millions of teenagers across every combatant nation, in conditions that nobody had designed to support them and that no official welfare system had specifically anticipated. It was quietly and without any formal acknowledgement the coming of age of an entire generation, conducted in the margins of a history that was paying attention to other things, by young people who managed it with a competence that nobody thought to measure because nobody had thought to look. Fact number 96. The particular exhaustion that wartime produced, the kind that was not ordinary tiredness and not clinical depression and not quite fear, but occupied the specific territory between all three, was described by civilian diarists and medical reports throughout the war with a consistent frustration at the difficulty of naming it precisely. It was the exhaustion of sustained readiness, the physiological cost of maintaining a nervous system in a state of low-level alert across months and years at a time, never fully relaxing because the conditions that had required alertness had not fully resolved. Contemporary military medicine had a developing vocabulary for acute stress, the sharp, dramatic breakdown that could follow a specific traumatic event, but almost no vocabulary for the chronic, low-level vigilance fatigue that sustained exposure to wartime conditions produced in ordinary civilians going about their ordinary lives. The condition went unnamed and largely untracked as it accumulated. Post-war epidemiological studies, comparing health outcomes between civilians who had lived through years of bombing and blackout with those who had not, found statistically significant differences in cardiovascular disease, autoimmune conditions, and certain psychiatric diagnoses that were consistent with long-term stress exposure. By that point, however, the specific daily experiences that had produced those outcomes had been filed under the broad heading of wartime hardship and the records moved on. The cost had been paid. The bill had never been properly itemized, and the people who had paid it, characteristically, did not present it for reimbursement. Fact number 97. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 did not end the blackout all at once, and it did not end the habits of mind that the blackout had built over 5.5 years. VE Day itself, its crowds, its lights, its famous celebrations, has been extensively documented. What has received almost no documentation is what came immediately after, the weeks and months during which millions of people who had organized their daily lives entirely around the requirements and rhythms of a world at war found themselves in the bewildering position of no longer needing those routines. The blackout curtains came down, but some households continued to check their windows before turning on the lights, because the habit sat deeper than the regulation. Rationing continued for years. Food rationing in Britain did not end until 1954, and the daily queue at the ration shop continued, but the psychological register in which it was performed had changed in ways that no official record noted. The wartime daily routine did not end on a specific date. It faded, gradually and unevenly, as the conditions that had created it slowly and incompletely dissolved. It left behind in many people a residue of attentiveness and frugality and readiness that the post-war world neither required nor entirely erased. These were people who had learned at some cost and over a considerable length of time how to manage with less. That knowledge, once acquired, did not simply disappear because the less was no longer necessary. It stayed quietly in the hands and habits of a generation that had paid for it and was not entirely willing to put it down. Fact number 98. The postal system deserves acknowledgement as the hidden emotional infrastructure of the wartime years, the mechanism on which the daily inner life of separated families depended in ways that no other wartime system came close to matching. The British General Post Office handled over 1.5 billion letters and parcels to and from armed forces personnel in 1943 alone. That number requires a moment to absorb. 1.5 billion individual pieces of correspondence, each one the product of someone sitting down in difficult circumstances to reach across the distance towards someone they loved. The letter that arrived, or did not arrive, at a specific household on a specific morning was the product of that enormous system, and it arrived into a domestic space whose entire daily atmosphere it could transform. The posture of the body during letter reading, slightly hunched and very still, as though physical stillness could help the words arrive more clearly. The rereading, sometimes immediately, sometimes later in the day when the first reading had been too much to fully absorb. The folding and placing of the letter in a specific location. The composition of the reply that would begin that same evening and be finished over the following days. This daily emotional circuit, sending, waiting, receiving, responding, was the most important non-military communication network of the entire war. It connected the front to the home and the home to the front across distances and conditions that should by any reasonable measure have made connection impossible. That it worked consistently and at such scale across the full duration of the war is one of the quieter miracles of the entire period. Fact number 99. The generation that survived the Second World War emerged from it carrying something that was difficult to name and impossible to transfer. A transformed relationship with the texture of ordinary daily experience that colored everything they subsequently lived. The mundane, a warm meal on a proper plate, a lit room, a bed that could be slept in without preparation, a morning that began with no particular threat attached to it, had been made precious by its absence, and many veterans and civilians carried that preciousness forward into their peacetime lives as a quiet, persistent undercurrent. Paul Fussell, writing about returning servicemen, described a doubled vision of ordinary life, the capacity to see it simultaneously as it appeared and as it had appeared when it was gone, that made certain routine pleasures almost painfully vivid. The morning cup of tea, the sound of rain on a roof that was not going to be bombed, the face of a child in a kitchen that was warm and lit and had nothing wrong with it. These daily experiences, which had been entirely unremarkable before the war, carried for years afterward a quality of almost painful gratitude that was rarely spoken aloud and never officially recorded, because gratitude for ordinariness is not the kind of feeling that presents itself for documentation. It simply colors the daily life of those who feel it, invisibly, completely, and with a persistence that outlasts almost everything else. It was the war's most private legacy, carried quietly by the people who had earned it, and it went with them when they went. Fact number 100. There was a final daily habit of the wartime years that belongs in this series precisely because it occupied no official category, served no function that any institution could have identified, and left no record of any kind. It was the practice, observed across every country, every class, every level of education and experience, of simply sitting still for a few minutes at the end of the day, with no particular purpose. Usually after the children were settled, or the fire had burned down to embers, or the last letter had been written and folded and set aside for the morning post. In that sitting nothing happened that could be described or measured. A woman looked at the fire and thought of nothing in particular. or thought of everything without resolution. A soldier looked at the small square of sky visible through a tent opening and allowed his mind to be quiet for the first time in hours. A factory worker sat on the edge of a bunk and let the day's accumulated noise and effort gradually settle. These minutes were not productive. They were not restorative in any clinical sense. They were not prayer and not meditation and not rest. They were simply the person, present, without requirement, in the last small space of the day that belonged to no one and nothing else. They persisted through bombing and rationing and grief and exhaustion and the full impossible weight of what the war asked of ordinary people. Not because anyone decided to maintain them, but because being human in the end requires a certain amount of unscheduled silence, and that requirement does not pause even for a war. Fact number 101. On the morning of the 8th of May, 1945, across the cities and villages and farms of Britain and the liberated countries of Western Europe, people woke up and did what they had done on every other morning for the past 5.5 years. They rose, they dressed, they put the kettle on, they went to see whether the post had come. The routines looked the same from the outside, the same sequence of small actions, in the same order, at roughly the same hour as they had been performed on every preceding morning. And yet every person who performed them that morning knew, in a way that ordinary language does not quite reach, that something had changed, not in the routine itself, but in what the routine meant, in the feeling underneath it. The tea was still measured from the same tin. The bread was still rationed. The shoes were still patched at the heel. The gas mask was still hanging by the door, because nobody had thought yet to take it down. But the morning was different. The people who wrote about that morning, and many of them did write, the mass observation records are full of those entries, reached for the same word, independently, across dozens of different diaries and letters. Ordinary, they wrote. It felt ordinary, not meaning that nothing had happened or that nothing mattered, meaning that the world had been quietly restored to the condition of the merely everyday, which for years had seemed so remote as to be almost mythological. The most important morning of all those wartime mornings was the one that finally, after everything, had nothing wrong with it. The morning when waking up had no war in it. The morning when the long darkness was simply astonishingly over. The 101 facts gathered in this series were never supposed to exist, at least not in any form that official history was designed to preserve. They live, insofar as they live at all, in the margins of diaries kept in pencil on rationed paper, in the half-sentences of oral testimonies recorded by patient interviewers decades after the events they describe, in the raw data of welfare surveys that asked the wrong questions but occasionally, almost accidentally, implied the right ones. They are the habits and small decisions and daily private acts of a generation that spent nearly 6 years performing one of the greatest collective adaptations in modern history, with almost no acknowledgement that an adaptation was taking place. The argument for paying attention to them is not sentimental, it is simply this. History written only from official records produces a version of the past populated by systems and outcomes from which the actual experience of being alive during those events has been almost entirely removed. The records are accurate as far as they go. They simply do not go far enough into the texture of what it meant to be a person in that time, managing a household in the dark, learning to navigate a familiar street by touch, sitting still for 8 unwitnessed minutes before bed in a world that had been threatening for years to become something other than survivable. What this series has tried to trace is the specific embodied intelligence required to keep going under those conditions, the calibration of hope each morning, the encoding of love into letters that a censor would read before the person they were intended for, the navigation of a blacked-out street by memory and the tips of the fingers, the management of a child's breakfast with hands that had spent the night in a factory and a face that had been arranged, before coming downstairs, into something calm. These were not simple acts. They required judgment and endurance and a sustained willingness to invest effort in a future whose existence could not be guaranteed. And they were performed by people of every social class, every nationality, every level of education and formal preparation, which suggests that the capacity they drew on was not the product of training or privilege. It was something more widely and more democratically distributed, what might be called, without any sentimentality at all, the basic human insistence on continuing. There is also a lesson here about what gets preserved and what gets lost. Official archives keep what official systems produce. They do not keep the particular quality of silence on a blacked-out Sunday morning. They do not keep the way a woman's face changed when she heard the postman's footsteps on the path and could tell before the letters arrived whether there was something or nothing. They do not keep the specific weight of a child's hand in the dark of an Anderson shelter while everyone waited for the all clear. These things are not recoverable in full. What can be done, what this series has tried to do, is to name them carefully enough that their absence from the official record becomes legible, so that anyone who has listened to this understands not only what happened during those years, but what kind of thing we have lost the ability to fully know. The blackout lasted 5 years, 1 month, and 29 days. In that time, it took lives and isolated the elderly and frightened children and gave cover to cruelty and compressed the daily world of millions of people into a domestic interior that the darkness had made both more necessary and more bare. All of that is true and worth remembering. And also true, and also worth remembering is this, that above the blacked-out cities the stars came out, visible for the first time in a generation, that in the pubs and the cinemas and the living rooms with the wireless on, people gathered and were warmer together than they had perhaps known how to be before the dark made it necessary. That in the gardens, through all of it, things kept growing. That in the quiet at the end of each long day, people sat and breathed and allowed themselves to simply be present, without purpose, in the last few minutes that were entirely their own. Every small act mattered, every routine held meaning. Every quiet night was a lesson in resilience, in patience, in the kind of gentle and persistent endurance that leaves no official record and requires no recognition and is, for all of that, among the most genuinely human things that human beings do. Let that calm and steady rhythm carry you now, as it carried them through all those long and dark and quietly extraordinary nights, gently, warmly, all the way into rest.